Today we're going to talk about development and socialization. It's kind of an interesting chapter. We're going to talk about how people sleep, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. But yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. Development. This is chapter 5, of course. It's week 5, chapter 5. So we're about a third of the way through the semester. One key adaptation that enabled humans to distinguish themselves from their proto-chimpanzee ancestors was the ability to learn and accumulate cultural information so well. This adaptation allowed humans to learn the requisite technologies and skills to stake out a successful existence in such diverse environments as the ice-encased Arctic hinterland, the thick Amazonian jungle, the parched Kalahari Desert, and the dog-eat-dog corporate world of Wall Street. A sensitive period is a period of time in an organism's development that allows for the relatively easy acquisition of a set of skills. If an organism misses that chance to acquire those skills, it would have a difficult time doing so later after the sensitive period has expired. Human cultural learning continues throughout the lifespan, and this is one of the reasons that we tell parents that they need to stimulate their children throughout their lives. They need to provide some form of stimulation for their children. That's why we hang black and white forms in a newborn's bed so that they can get eye stimulation. The differences between the black and white is a form of stimulation. It's one of the reasons why mobiles exist. Children will gaze at things for extended lengths of time. Adults will do the same thing. They'll gaze at things for an extended length of time, trying to figure them out. Language ability is a hallmark human characteristic, and although there are rudimentary language skills in some other species, no other species is as dependent on language skills or has as complex a language system as humans. Humans are capable of producing, recognizing, and using approximately 150 phonemes. Phoneme is a unit of sound in communication. However, no language uses more than 70 of these sounds. And that's one of the reasons why the Dene language is very different from English. It's very different from Spanish. They each have their own unique sounds. People are not able to discriminate easily between phonemes that are not their own language. The Japanese language does not have separate phonemes for the sounds la and ra. Likewise, the Japanese language does not have a phoneme for va, although it does have a phoneme for ba. An adult who is exposed only to the Japanese language cannot perceive the differences between las and ras or between bas and vas, phonemes that sound obviously different in English speakers. To the Japanese, rubber is indistinguishable from lover. And this is a film. This is a piece of film from The Christmas Story. Let me do this first, and then we'll do. Oh, there we go.
Take the home with our glory. Tis the season to be jolly.
No. Not ra 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 la 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 la. Sing like this. Deck the halls with boughs of holly. Fa la 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 la. Try again.
Deck the hall with our glory.
Stop. Sing something else.
Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh.
No. Stop. Kitchen, bring food for customers. So,
Oh, yes, it's a beautiful duck. Yes, and it really is. It's but you see,
what?
it's smiling at me.
Okay. Beautiful.
Yeah, yes.
That Christmas would live in our memories as the Christmas when we were introduced to Chinese turkey. All was right with the world.
There you go. Okay, so that hard time saying law. Okay, interesting. If I can get this thing to work. Celtic, crag bog. Where does English come from? It comes from Celtic. Crag bog, whiskey, penguin, clan, plaid, shamrock, slogan, trousers galore. Those are all Celtic words. Anglo-Saxon, apple, blood, cheerleader, iron, jump. These are all Anglo-Saxon words. The Vikings actually conquered England for a while, or they conquered it actually. They were there. They landed and they stayed. And these are Scandinavian words. Ugly, knife, die, cake, skull, the days of the week are all Viking words. Latin, of course, is part of the English language. Have, agriculture, casino, bonus, fame. And then French, of course, the Normans conquered England in 1066. And these are French words: priest, infantry, money, jury, isle, and music. Those are all examples of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Latin, and French words. Research suggests that young infants can discriminate among all the phonemes that humans are able to produce. Native English-speaking babies of 6 to 8 months can reliably distinguish between two sounds from the Hindi language, but 10 to 12-month-old native English speakers cannot. Even 4-day-old infants already show a preference for the rhythm of sounds from their own language over other languages. And of course, they have done studies showing that babies understand their own language. They hear it from their mother and whoever is around their mother while they're in the womb. They can actually hear the rhythm of the language and the phonemes. So they start reacting to them fairly quickly. This research suggests that we are biologically prepared to attend to human speech as we come into this world. We are predisposed to start picking up languages at an early age. Early in life, before puberty, our brains are especially pliable for organizing themselves in response to language input. Later on, our brains are not as flexible. Humans are better at acquiring and mastering languages early in life. And of course, this is one of the reasons why they tell you if you're going to learn a second language that you need to do that as a child before the age of 12. For bilinguals who learn their second language later in life, one part of the brain is active when they hear their second language and another when they hear their native language. Both parts are in Broca's area. Bilinguals who learn their second language early in life showed activation in the same part of the brain, regardless of whether they were hearing their second language or their native one. So those of you who learned the Dene language and the English language when you were young, the same parts of your brain are hearing and speaking those languages. Keller in 2007 looked at the rearing practices of urban middle-class Germans, Greeks, Costa Ricans, rural Indian Gujarati, and Cameroonians. Cameroon is a wait a second. Let me do this. Cameroon is an African country. Greece is a southern European country. Costa Rica is in Central America, and Germany, of course, is in Europe. Is in Eastern. Well, it's not really in Eastern Europe. It's the beginning of Eastern Europe, I guess. And then, of course, India, you know where India is. So these are our 5 different areas around the world. Observing how much bodily contact the parents had with their infants, Keller found that European parents spend the least time in contact with their infants. And here's a lady trying to hold on to a baby. She's got a German soccer shirt on, as does the baby. And you can see how she's grabbing hold of the kid. Not a very friendly way to hold somebody. The infants from the other cultural groups spent the majority of their time being held by their mothers. During Keller's observation in 2007, there was not a single observation when the Cameroonian infant wasn't being held by its mother. And as you can, this is a Cameroonian, of course, and there's the baby hanging from her back. Another variable that Keller investigated was the amount of face-to-face contact the mothers had with their infants. Urban European mothers spent most of their contact time in face-to-face contact. This is not true of other mothers, especially the Gujarati. And of course, this is what a Gujarati, somebody who is Gujarati looks like. Here she has face-to-face contact with her baby, but this is relatively rare. Normally, if they're holding their babies, they're hanging from their backs, or they're hanging from around their stomachs. The responses of the German mothers were more contingent to the baby's cries and behaviors than was found with the Cameroonian mothers, and this cultural difference predicted how quickly the babies learned to recognize themselves in a mirror. The more responsive their mother was to their cries, the younger the child was able to show self-recognition skills. Learning that others will respond to their cries facilitates infants' recognition that they have a distinct identity. Urban European babies tend to occupy their own physical space, and they are often in face-to-face contact with their mothers, putting them in a position to interact with their mothers as separate beings, as in turn-taking conversations, and their mothers are more responsive to their individual needs. In other cultures, infants share the same physical space with their mothers. Mothers are not as likely to be in a position to interact with their infants through face-to-face contact. In some regions of Africa, the Caribbean, and India, infants receive a daily massage and exercise regime, such as stretching their limbs or putting them into sitting positions. These experiences shape their development, and those who receive this kind of massage and exercise begin to sit on their own and walk at earlier ages than those that do not. Cultural practices such as putting infants to sleep on their backs rather than their stomachs can delay when children begin to crawl, roll over, or learn to stand. In cultures that do not encourage crawling, large proportions of children never crawl, but instead scoot along on their butts or proceed directly to walking. And strangely, this is what both of my kids did. Neither of them were crawlers. They just kind of stood right up and started walking. My son started walking at 8 months, and my daughter started walking at 9 months. If you are of European descent and grew up in a North American household, the odds are that your parents set aside a room in their house, perhaps decorating it with pastel colors and scenes of romping bunny rabbits, and put a crib in it for you to sleep in, so you had your own separate room from birth. In a study of 136 societies, infants in 2/3 of these groups slept in the same bed as their mothers. In the majority of the other cases, infants slept in the same room as their mothers, but in a different bed. American parents were the only ones in a survey of 100 societies who created a separate room for the baby to sleep in. The practice of co-sleeping is also quite common in other subcultures in the United States. African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics all co-sleep with their children. The practice of people sleeping separately in their own beds has not yet been identified in a single subsistence society around the world. Schrader et al. In 1995 developed a study where they gave participants a scenario as to how to house a family in 3 bedrooms consisting of a mother, a father, a son who was 15, a son who was 11, a son who was 8, a daughter who was 14, and a daughter who was 3. 88% of the Americans given the scenario chose the following configuration. Room 1, father and mother. Room 2, the 2 daughters share the room. Room 3, the 3 sons share the room. And this is known as the Brady Bunch solution because this is pretty much what the Brady Bunch did. Americans seek to avoid incest. The second most important principle was the sacred couple. Married couples should be given their own space for emotional intimacy and sexual privacy. The third most important principle is the autonomy, the belief that young children who are needy and vulnerable should learn to be self-reliant and take care of themselves. When people in India were given the same scenario, they based their answers on the following four criteria. Incest avoidance, post-pubescent children of the opposite sex should not sleep in the same room. Protection of the vulnerable, young children should not be left alone at night. Female chastity anxiety, post-pubescent females should always be chaperoned. Respect for the hierarchy. Post-pubescent boys are conferred social status by not having them sleep with parents or young children. One of the most popular configurations from India involved bedroom 1, the mother, the father, and the 3-year-old daughter. Bedroom 2, 14-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son. And bedroom 3, 15-year-old son and 11-year-old son. A second popular Indian configuration involved bedroom 1, father and 8-year-old son. Bedroom 2, 15-year-old son and 11-year-old son. And bedroom 3, the mother, the 3-year-old daughter, and the 14-year-old daughter. North American children live in an environment where they are by themselves from a very early age and must cry out to their parents when they have needs to be taken care of. Children from many other cultures, in contrast, may live in an environment where their mother is always around. Often, as in many cultures, the children are literally carried by their mother throughout the day. Mothers do not need to be called to, as they are always present to respond to the child's needs. In 1971, Baumrind published her tripartite typology of parenting styles. Authoritarian parenting, low levels of warmth or responsiveness by the parents to the child's protests. Authoritative parenting, child-centered approach, parents maintain high expectations of maturity for their children. And permissive parenting, parents are very involved with their children. Much express parental warmth and responsiveness. Parents place few limits and controls on the children's behavior. While Western parents are more demonstrative than most other parents, Chow in 1994 argues that training is a core part of the Chinese parenting. It is an effort to have the children adhere to socially desired behaviors, often by providing the child with explicit examples of proper behavior, and it entails much devotion and sacrifice on the part of the parents. Contrary to Western findings, strong parental control has been found to be associated with increased family cohesion, perceived parental warmth and acceptance, and better academic achievement in China, Japan, and Korea. European American high school students viewed any pressure by their mother to be largely negative and indicative that they didn't feel supported by their mother. Asian American high school students didn't view maternal pressure in negative terms. When Asian American students reflected on their mother pressuring them to work hard on a task, they were more motivated to complete a task on their own. Japanese adolescents even feel rejected by their parents when they experience only little parental control and a broader range of autonomy. However, authoritarian parenting styles, as defined by Baumrind in 1971, have been found to be associated with more stressed mothers, and this is according to Su and Heine in 2012, and to lead to increased psychological maladjustment among children across a variety of both Western and non-Western cultures, including the Chinese. And this is according to Kin, Pomerantz, and Wang in 2009, and then Sorkabi in 2005. In general, children are less happy with strongly controlling parents, and this effect is found across many cultures. There are obvious differences between the parenting philosophies of North American and Chinese parents. North American children come to learn that they are independent agents to which their mothers respond, whereas the Chinese children learn that they are relational beings who need to respond to their mothers. North American mothers are more likely to discuss their children's successes and positive emotional experiences with them, thereby emphasizing that what the child is able to accomplish. Chinese mothers are more likely to call attention to their child's mistakes and transgressions, thereby elaborating on how the child needs to change to fit in better. And this is according to Miller, Wiley, Fung, and Liang in 1997, and then Wang in 2001. Around the age of 18 months, young children enter a period of accelerated word learning when their vocabularies begin to increase dramatically. A great deal of research has indicated that this increase in vocabulary is not distributed equally across all different forms of words. The first words that children learn are nouns. There's a great deal of evidence that North American children tend to learn nouns much quicker than verbs. Chinese children are found to use more verbs than nouns. There is no noun bias among Korean toddlers. So when you learn English, the first thing you learn is the nouns. Ball. And then you learn the verbs. Hit ball. The structure of English is such that nouns tend to come in rather salient locations, such as at the end of sentences. East Asian languages, such as Japanese and Korean, tend to place verbs in salient positions at the end of sentences. Unlike in English, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean languages allow for nouns and pronouns to be dropped when the context is clear. Westerners tend to perceive the world in a more analytic fashion, seeing objects as discrete and separate, whereas East Asians are more likely to perceive the world in holistic terms, stressing the relations between objects. It is plausible that the cultural differences in the noun bias reflect this difference in thinking about the world. Japanese toddlers have been shown to make fewer demands on their parents than their American counterparts, and are less likely to assert their disobedience. These occasions when Japanese toddlers do act unruly tend to be viewed as signs of blossoming individuality, but rather as indicators of their immaturity. So in the United States, if a child acted out, we would see them as seeking autonomy, and in Japan, it would be an act of immaturity. So it's a definition of terms. The developmental goal embraced by Japanese parents is much less a desire to see their children learn how to individuate and assert themselves than it is for them to learn how to accommodate to others and to become part of a harmonious social group. Now, one of the things that you need to remember about Japan and China and Korea is that they're very crowded countries. And because they're so crowded, individualism is not possible, for one thing, because they're so crowded. Japanese looks like a big country, but the reality is that only 30% of the country is habitable. The rest of Japan is volcanic mountains that are inhabitable. China, there's over 1.5 billion people in China, very crowded place. Korea has a very large population as well, and it only inhabits half the peninsula. Well, South Korea inhabits half the peninsula, and North Korea is the other. It's just a peninsula. It's not very large. There's not very much land mass. Lots of people with not very much land mass. So that's one of the things you have to remember. If you look at the United States, here I am. I'm living in the middle of a cornfield. My closest neighbor is a half mile down the road. In China that wouldn't happen because there are just too many people. Many cultures demonstrated tendencies for adolescents to act in the rebellious way familiar to the West. However, this was by no means universal. Rather, expectations for such antisocial behaviors were present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys and in only 18% of societies for girls. Girls need to be controlled because you need to control their reproductive capabilities. And that's the way most societies deal with young females. And that's one of the reasons why when something happens around the world and people are complaining about women not having as many rights, it's the reality is women don't have as many rights as males from birth because the society is pretty much trying to control their reproductive aspect. And so things need to be interpreted through that lens. The United States is one of the more liberal countries in the world, um, and so if we're dealing with somebody from Costa Rica, or if you're dealing with somebody who's Hispanic, a lot of Hispanic countries, they will not allow young females to go outside unless they are escorted by somebody. They're chaperoned by either by a male relative or a female relative. They're not really allowed to go wander around by themselves. The majority of cultures studied did not expect adolescents to behave especially disobediently. The notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. Rather, only 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and only 3% of societies had such expectations for girls. And most of these countries that allow for disobedience and rebelliousness are Western countries, such as in Western Europe and in North America and in Australia. The experiences of adolescence in Germany, Scotland, Japan, Bali, and Batak were compared, and the results indicated that both individualism and modernity seemed to increase the difficulties in adolescence. In particular, there appears to be more conflict between children and their parents in individualistic societies where children seem to view parental control as a constraint they must resist. There seems to be increased adolescent distress, especially due to the sheer range of opportunities that confront children as societies industrialize and become more urbanized. One task in adolescence is to learn how to accept adult roles. This is much more straightforward when there are fewer role distinctions and when youths are more in contact with adults as they are in more traditional agricultural societies. The number of choices has continued to grow, which has lengthened the period of adolescence, sometimes referred to as failure to launch or emerging adulthood. The transition to adulthood has been marked by 5 milestones: completing school, leaving home, becoming financially independent, getting married, having at least one child. I did all of this by the time I was 19 years old. Well, I completed high school anyway. I was in college when I had my first child. I left home at 17 to go away to college. I wasn't really financially independent until I graduated from college and joined the military. But I got married while I was in college, and I had my first child while I was in college. So I all of this took place for me when I was 19 to 20 years old. In the United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. Looking at my two children, as soon as they completed high school, they both went away to college. My son went to Purdue and my daughter went to Nebraska Wesleyan. So they left home at 18. Both of them left home at 18. Becoming financially independent, both of them started work. My daughter started working to buy herself a car, to buy herself a car, when she was 16 or 17 years old. She didn't get married until she was 2000. How old was she in 2000? She was 20. She was 31 when she got married. When she got married, my son still isn't married, and my daughter had her baby at 42, and my son doesn't have any children. In the United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. And of course, not my son. He still doesn't have any children, and he probably won't have any children, I'm guessing. In 2000, fewer than half the women and less than 1/3 of the men had done so by this age. East Asian children spent more days in school, 240 days per year in Japan versus 180 days per year in the United States. A greater percentage of class time was devoted to math education in the Asian school day than in the American school. Asian teachers spent a greater percentage of time lecturing in the classroom compared with their American counterparts, 90% in Taiwan compared to 46% in the United States. Asian math lessons, approximately 80% of the examples were real world in Japan, compared with about 10% of examples in American classes. Asian teachers assigned more homework to students. Fifth graders in the United States had less than half as much homework assigned to them as Taiwanese students. Asian parents seem to view education as more central to their children's lives than American parents do. Asian parents are more likely to provide their children with a desk. One study revealed that 98% of Taiwanese fifth graders had a desk in their home, compared with only 63% of American kids. Stevenson in 1992 asked fifth graders to imagine that there was a wizard who would grant them anything they wished for. About 70% of the wishes listed by Chinese students had to do with education. They wished for success in school or to be able to go to college. In contrast, only about 10% of American children wished for things relevant to education. About 10% of American children wished for less school. Oh man. The East Asian children are doing much better as a group on math tests than the American children. Thus, one might expect East Asian mothers to be especially satisfied with their children's performance. This does not seem to be the case. Rather, the American mothers report being far more satisfied with their children's performance than the East Asian mothers. Compared with mothers of first grade children, Chinese and Japanese mothers of fifth grade children reported that a higher standard of achievement was necessary for them to be satisfied with their children's math performance. In stark contrast, the standards of American mothers were lower for fifth grade children than first grade children. It appears to be far easier to meet standards of American mothers than East Asian mothers. This would suggest that American children have less reason to work hard at their studies than East Asian children. Numbers are harder to learn in English than in Japanese, Korean, or Chinese because there are more irregular numbered words in English. East Asian counting systems incorporate the base 10 concept, which is necessary for learning how to do multi-digit arithmetic in a more straightforward way than English does. Thus, English speakers need more conceptual support for the base 10 concept than do speakers of East Asian languages. And that is the end of the lecture. So, interesting ideas, something to ponder anyway. So we don't do very well with math. And that is it. I'll talk to you next